Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Heidi, starting with Chapter 5, 2 Visits and What Came of Them. Quickly the winter passed, and still more quickly the bright, glad summer. Another winter was drawing to its close. Heidi looked forward with more delight each day to the coming spring, when the warm south wind would roar through the fir trees and blow away the snow, and the warm sun would entice the blue and yellow flowers to show their heads, and the long days out on the mountain would come again, which seemed to give her the greatest joy that the earth could give. Heidi was now in her 8th year. She had learned all kinds of useful things from her grandfather. She knew how to look after the goats as well as anyone. Little Swan and Little Bear followed her like 2 faithful dogs. Twice during the course of this last winter, Peter had brought up a message from the schoolmaster at Dorfley. He sent word to Alm Uncle that he ought to send Heidi to school, but the old man paid no attention to the message. The March sun had melted the snow on the mountainside, and the snowdrops were peeping out all over the valley, and the fir trees had shaken off their burden of snow and were again merrily waving their branches in the air. As Heidi was running about one sunny morning and had just jumped over the water trough for the tenth time at least, she nearly fell backwards into it with fright, for there in front of her, looking gravely at her, stood an old gentleman dressed in black. When he saw how startled she was, he said in a kind voice, "Don't be afraid of me, for I am very fond of children. Shake hands. You must be the Heidi I have heard of. Where is your grandfather?" "He is sitting by the table making round wooden spoons," Heidi informed him as she opened the door. The stranger was the old village pastor from Dorfley, who had been a neighbor of Uncle's when he lived down there and had known him well. He stepped inside the hut and, going up to the old man who was bending over his work, said, "Good morning, neighbor." The grandfather looked up in surprise and then, rising, said, "Good morning," in return. He pushed his chair toward the visitor. "If you do not mind a wooden seat, there is one for you," he said. The pastor sat down. "It is a long time since I have seen you, neighbor," he said. "Or I you," was the answer. "I have come today to talk over something with you," continued the pastor. "I think you know already what it is that has brought me here," and as he spoke he looked toward the child who was standing at the door, gazing with interest and surprise at the stranger. "Heidi, go off to the goats," said her grandfather. "You may take them a little salt and stay with them till I come." Heidi disappeared at once. "The child ought to have been at school a year ago, and most certainly this last winter," said the pastor. "The schoolmaster sent you word about it, but you gave him no answer. What are you thinking of doing with the child, neighbor?" "I am thinking of not sending her to school," was the answer. The visitor, surprised, looked across at the old man, who was sitting on his bench with his arms crossed and a determined expression about his whole person. "How are you going to let her grow up, then?" he asked. "I am going to let her grow up and be happy among the goats and birds. With them she is safe and will learn nothing evil." "But the child is not a goat or a bird. She is a human being. If she learns no evil from these comrades of hers, she will at the same time learn no good. She ought not to grow up in ignorance, and it is time she began her lessons. I have come now that you may have leisure to think over it and to arrange about it during the summer. This is the last winter that she must be allowed to run wild. Next winter she must come regularly to school every day." "She will do no such thing," said the old man with calm determination. "Do you mean that by no persuasion can you be brought to see reason, and that you intend to stick obstinately to your decision?" said the pastor, growing somewhat angry. "You have been about the world and must have seen and learned much, and I should have given you credit for more sense, neighbor." "Indeed," replied the old man, and there was a tone in his voice that betrayed a growing irritation on his part, too. "And does the worthy pastor really mean that he would wish me next winter to send a young child like that some miles down the mountain on ice-cold mornings through storm and snow, and let her return at night when the wind is raging, when even one like ourselves would run a risk of being blown down by it and buried in the snow? And perhaps he may not have forgotten the child's mother, Adelaide. She was a sleepwalker and had fainting spells. Might not the child be attacked in the same way if obliged to overexert herself? And someone thinks he can come and force me to send her. I will go before all the courts of justice in the country, and then we shall see who will force me to do it." "You are quite right, neighbor," said the pastor in a friendly tone of voice. "I understand that it would have been impossible to send the child to school from here, but I see that the child is dear to you. For her sake, do what you ought to have done long ago. Come down into Dorfley and live again among your fellow men. What sort of life is this you lead, alone and with bitter thoughts toward God and man? I should think that you must be half frozen to death in this hut in the winter, and I do not know how the child lives through it. The child has young blood in her veins and a good roof over her head, and let me further tell the pastor that I know where wood is to be found, and when is the proper time to bring it in. The fire is never out in my hut the whole winter through. I could not go to live in Dorfley. The people despise me, and I them. It is therefore best for all of us that we live apart. No, no, it is not best for you, said the pastor in an earnest voice. Believe me, neighbor, the people down there do not dislike you so much as you think. Excuse me. Seek to make your peace with God, pray for forgiveness where you need it, and then come and see how differently people will look upon you and how happy you may yet be. The pastor had risen and stood holding out his hand to the old man as he added with renewed earnestness, I will wager, neighbor, that next winter you will be down among us again, and we shall be good neighbors as of old. Uncle gave the pastor his hand and answered him calmly and firmly, You mean well by me, I know. But I say now what I shall continue to say, that I will not send the child to school, nor come and live among you. Then God help you, said the pastor, and he turned sadly away and left the hut and went down the mountain. Uncle was out of humor. When Heidi said as usual that afternoon, Can we go down to grandmother now? He answered, Not today. He did not speak again the whole of that day, and the following morning, when Heidi asked again the same question, he replied, We will see. But before the dinner bowls had been cleared away, another visitor arrived, and this time it was Aunt Detta. She had a fine feathered hat on her head and a long trailing skirt to her dress which swept the floor. The grandfather looked her up and down without uttering a word, but Detta was prepared with an exceedingly pleasant speech and began at once to praise the looks of the child. She told Uncle that she had never lost sight of the idea of taking the child back again, for she well understood that the little one must be much in his way, but she had not been able to do it at first. At last she had heard of something that would be a lucky chance for Heidi. Some immensely wealthy relatives of the people she was serving, who had one of the most beautiful houses in Frankfurt, had an only daughter, young and an invalid, who was always obliged to go about in a wheeled chair. She was therefore very much alone and had no one to share her lessons. Her father had spoken to Detta's mistress about finding a companion for her. The housekeeper had described the sort of child they wanted, simple-minded and unspoiled, and not like most of the children that one saw nowadays. Detta had thought at once of Heidi, and had gone off without delay to see the housekeeper. After Detta had given her a description of Heidi, she had immediately agreed to take her, and no one could tell what good fortune there might be in store for Heidi if she was once with these people and they took a fancy to her. Have you nearly finished what you had to say? Broke in Uncle, who had allowed her to talk on uninterruptedly so far. Ugh! Exclaimed Detta, throwing up her head in disgust. One would think I had been talking to you about the most ordinary matter. Why, there is not one person in all Pratigau who would not thank God for such news. You may take your news to anybody you like. I will have nothing to do with it. But now Detta leaped up from her seat like a rocket and cried, If that is all you have to say about it, why then I will give you a bit of my mind. The child is now 8 years old and knows nothing, and you will not let her learn. You will not send her to church or school, as I was told down in Dorfley. She is my own sister's child, and I am responsible for what happens to her. I have everybody in Dorfley on my side. I advise you to think well before bringing it into court, if that is your intention. There are certain things which might be brought up against you, which you would not care to hear. Be silent, thundered the uncle, and his eyes flashed with anger. Go and be done with you. Never let me see you again with your hat and feather. Excuse me, and such words on your tongue as you come with today. And with that he strode out of the hut. Excuse me. You have made grandfather angry, said Heidi, and her dark eyes had anything but a friendly expression in them as she looked at Detta. He will soon be all right. Come now, said Detta hurriedly, and show me where your clothes are. I am not coming, said Heidi. Nonsense, exclaimed Detta. Then altering her tone to one half coaxing, half cross, she said, Come, come, you do not understand any better than your grandfather. You will have all sorts of good things that you never dreamed of. Then she went to the cupboard and, taking out Heidi's things, rolled them up in a bundle. Come along now. There's your hat. It is very shabby, but it will do for the present. Put it on and let us hurry away. I am not coming, repeated Heidi. Don't be so stupid and obstinate like a goat. Listen to me. You saw that your grandfather was angry, and you heard what he said, that he did not wish ever to see us again. He wants you now to go away with me, and you must not make him angrier still. You can't think how nice it is at Frankfurt, and if you do not like it, you can come back again. Your grandfather will be in a good temper again by that time. Can I return at once and be back home again here this evening? Asked Heidi. What are you talking about? Come along now. I tell you that you can come back here when you like. Today we shall go as far as Mayenfeld, and early tomorrow we shall start in the train, and that will bring you home again in no time when you wish it, for it goes as fast as the wind. Detta put the bundle under her arm and took the child by the hand, and so they went down the mountain together. On the way they met Peter, who had stolen a holiday from school that day. He thought it a far better employment to wander about a bit and look for stout sticks which might be wanted some day. He had evidently been well rewarded that day for his labors, for he was carrying an immense bundle of long, thick hazel sticks on his shoulders. He stood still and stared at the two approaching figures. As they came up to him, he exclaimed, "Where are you going, Heidi?" "I am only just going over to Frankfurt for a little visit with Detta," she replied. "But I must first run in to grandmother. She will be expecting me." "No, no, you must not stop to talk. It is already too late," said Detta, holding fast to Heidi's hand as she struggled to get away. "You may go in when you come back. You must come along now," and she pulled the child on with her, fearing that if she let her go in, the grandmother might detain her. Peter ran into the hut and banged against the table with his bundle of sticks with such violence that everything in the room shook, and his grandmother leaped up with a cry of alarm from her spinning wheel. "What is the matter? What is the matter?" cried the frightened old woman. "She is taking Heidi away," Peter said crossly. "Who? Who? Where to, Peter? Where to?" asked the grandmother, growing still more agitated. But even as she spoke, she guessed what had happened, for Brigitte had told her shortly before that she had seen Detta going up to Alm-Onkel. The old woman rose hastily and with trembling hands opened the window and called out beseechingly, "Detta, Detta, do not take the child away from us. Do not take her away." When Heidi heard that, she struggled to get free, crying, "Grandmother is calling. I must go to her." But Detta had no intention of letting the child go. She told her that when she wanted to return home, she could do so at once, and then she could take something she liked back to grandmother. This was a new idea to Heidi, and it pleased her so much that Detta had no longer any difficulty in getting her along. After a few minutes' silence, Heidi asked, "What could I take back to her?" "We must think of something nice," answered Detta. "She would enjoy a soft roll of white bread, for now she is old. She can hardly eat the hard black bread." "No, she always gives it back to Peter, telling him it is too hard. I have seen her do it myself," agreed Heidi. "Do let us make haste, for then perhaps we can get back soon from Frankfurt, and I shall be able to give her the white bread today." Heidi started running so fast that Detta, with the bundle under her arm, could scarcely keep up with her. But she was glad, nevertheless, to get along so quickly. She went on straight ahead through Dorfli, holding Heidi tightly by the hand so that all the people might see that it was on the child's account she was hurrying along at such a rate. To all their questions and remarks she made answer as she passed, "I can't stop now, as you see. I must make haste with the child, for we have yet some way to go." "Are you taking her away? Is she running away from Alm-Onkel? It's a wonder she is still alive. But what rosy cheeks she has." Such were the words they heard on all sides. From that day Alm-Onkel looked fiercer and more forbidding than ever when he came down and passed through Dorfli. He spoke to no one, and looked like such an ogre with his thick frowning eyebrows drawn together as he came along with his pack of cheeses on his back and his immense stick in one hand, that the women would call to their little ones, "Take care! Get out of Alm-Onkel's way, or he may hurt you." The old man took no notice of anybody as he strode through the village on his way to the valley below, where he sold his cheeses and bought what bread and meat he wanted for himself. After he had passed, the villagers all crowded together looking after him, and each had something to say about him, how much wilder he looked than usual, and how now he would not even respond to anybody's greeting. They all agreed that it was a great mercy the child had gotten away from him. They had all noticed how the child had hurried along, as if afraid that her grandfather might be following to take her back. Only the blind grandmother would have nothing to say against him. She told those who came to her to bring her work or take away what she had spun, how kind and thoughtful he had been with the child, how good to her and her daughter, and how many afternoons he had spent mending the house which, but for his help, would certainly by this time have fallen down over their heads. All this was repeated down in Dorfli, but most of the people did not believe it. The days were sad again now for the old blind woman, and not one passed but what she would murmur complainingly, "Alas! All our happiness and pleasure have gone with the child, and now the days are so long and dreary. Pray God that Heidi comes again before I die." Chapter 6, a new chapter about new things. In her home at Frankfurt, Clara, the little daughter of Mr. Sesemann, was sitting in the rolling chair in which she spent her whole day. She was wheeled in it from room to room as she wished. Just now she was in what was known as the study. Clara's little face was thin and pale. At this moment her soft blue eyes were fixed on the clock, which seemed to her to go very slowly this day. With a slight accent of impatience, which was very rare with her, she asked, "Isn't it time yet, Miss Rottenmeier?" This lady was sitting up very straight at a small work table, busy with her embroidery. She had on a mysterious-looking loose garment with a large collar or shoulder cape that gave to her appearance a certain solemnity, which was increased by a very high dome-shaped headdress. For many years past, since the mistress of the house had died, Miss Rottenmeier had been the housekeeper. Mr. Sesemann was often away from home, and he left her in sole charge. The only condition he made was that his little daughter should have a voice in all matters, and that nothing should be done against her wish. As Clara was putting her impatient question for the second time, Detta and Heidi arrived at the front door. Detta inquired of the coachman, who had just descended from his box, if it was too late to see Miss Rottenmeier. "That's not my business," grumbled the coachman. "Ring the bell in the hall for Sebastian." Detta did so, and Sebastian came downstairs. He looked astonished when he saw her, opening his eyes till they were nearly as big as the large round buttons on his coat. "Is it too late for me to see Miss Rottenmeier?" Detta asked again. "That's not my business," answered the man. "Ring that other bell for the maid Tinette." Without troubling himself any further, Sebastian disappeared. Detta rang again. This time Tinette appeared. "What is it?" she called from the top of the stairs. Detta repeated her question. Tinette disappeared, but soon came back and called down to Detta, "Come up, she is expecting you." Detta and Heidi went upstairs and into the study. Detta remained standing politely near the door while holding Heidi tightly by the hand. Miss Rottenmeier rose slowly and went up to the new little companion for the daughter of the house. She did not seem very pleased with the child's appearance. Heidi was dressed in her plain little woolen frock, and her hat was an old straw one, bent out of shape. The child looked innocently out from under it, gazing with unconcealed astonishment at the lady's towering headdress. "What is your name?" asked Miss Rottenmeier. "Heidi," the child answered in a clear, ringing voice. "What? What? That's no Christian name for a child. You were not christened that. What name did they give you when you were baptized?" demanded Miss Rottenmeier. "I do not remember," replied Heidi. "What a way to answer," said the lady, shaking her head. "Detta, is the child a simpleton or only saucy?" "If the lady will allow me, I will speak for the child, for she is very unaccustomed to strangers," said Detta, giving Heidi a poke for making such an unsuitable answer. "This is the first time she has been in a gentleman's house, and she does not know good manners. I hope the lady will excuse her. She was christened Adelaide after her mother, my sister, who is now dead." "Well, that's a name that one can pronounce," remarked Miss Rottenmeier. "But I must tell you, Detta, that I am astonished to see so young a child. I told you that I wanted a companion of the same age as the young lady of the house, one who could share her lessons and all her other occupations. Miss Clara is now over 12. What age is this child?" "I am sorry," said Detta, "but I myself had lost count of her exact age. I cannot say precisely, but I think she is about 10. "Grandfather told me I was 8, put in Heidi. Detta gave her another poke, but the child had not the least idea why, and was not at all confused. "What? Only 8? cried Miss Rottenmeier angrily. 4 years too young. Of what use is such a child? And what have you learned? What books did you have to learn from?" "None," said Heidi. "How? What? How then did you learn to read?" demanded the lady. "I have never learned to read, or Peter either," Heidi informed her. "Mercy upon us, you do not know how to read? Is it really so?" exclaimed Miss Rottenmeier, greatly horrified. "Is it possible? Not able to read? What have you learned then?" "Nothing," said Heidi with unflinching truthfulness. "Young woman," said the lady to Detta when she had paused for a minute or two to recover from her shock, "this is not at all the sort of companion you led me to expect. How could you think of bringing me a child like this?" But Detta was not to be put down so easily, and answered warmly, "I am sorry, but the child is exactly what I thought you wanted. You said you wished a child unlike all other children, and I thought this child seemed as if made for the place. But I must go now, for my mistress will be waiting for me. I will come again soon and see how the child is getting on." And with a bow, Detta quickly left the room and ran downstairs. Miss Rottenmeier ran after her. If the child was to stay, she had many things yet to ask about her. Heidi remained by the door where she had been standing when she first came in. Clara had looked on during the interview without speaking. Now she beckoned to Heidi and said, "Come here." Heidi went up to her. "Would you rather be called Heidi or Adelaide?" asked Clara. "I am never called anything but Heidi," was the child's prompt answer. "Then I shall always call you by that name," said Clara. "It suits you. I have never heard it before, but neither have I ever seen a child like you before. Have you always had that short curly hair?" "Yes, I think so," said Heidi. "Are you pleased to come to Frankfurt?" went on Clara. No, but I shall go home again tomorrow and take grandmother a white loaf, explained Heidi. Well, you are a funny child, exclaimed Clara. You were expressly sent for to come stay with me and share my lessons. There will be some fun about them now, since you cannot read. Often they are dreadfully dull, and I think the morning will never pass away. You know my tutor comes every morning at about 10 o'clock, and then we go on with lessons till 2, and it does seem such a long time. I often want to yawn, but I am obliged to stop myself, for if Miss Rottenmeier sees me yawning, she runs off at once and gets the cod liver oil, and says I must have a dose because I am getting weak again. The cod liver oil is horrible, so I do my best not to yawn. But now it will be much more amusing, for I shall be able to lie and listen while you learn to read. Heidi shook her head doubtfully when she heard of learning to read. Oh, nonsense, Heidi. Of course you must learn to read. Everybody must, and my tutor is very kind and never cross, and he will explain everything to you. Miss Rottenmeier now came back into the room. She had not been able to overtake Detta and was evidently very much put out. She felt responsible for Heidi's coming, and she did not know how to undo the mischief. Presently Sebastian flung open the folding doors leading into the dining room. He then went up to Clara's chair to wheel her into the next room. Heidi stood staring at him. Seeing her eyes fixed upon him, he suddenly growled out, "Well, what is there in me to stare at like that?" "You look so like Peter," answered Heidi. Sebastian wheeled Clara into the dining room and helped her to her place. Miss Rottenmeier took the seat beside her and made a sign to Heidi to take the one opposite. They were the only three at the table, and they sat far apart. And as they sat far apart, there was plenty of room for Sebastian to hand his dishes. Beside Heidi's plate lay a white roll, and her eyes lighted up with pleasure as she saw it. The resemblance which Heidi had noticed had evidently awakened in her a feeling of confidence toward Sebastian, for she sat as still as a mouse and without moving until he came up to her side and handed her the dish of fish. Then she looked at the roll and asked, "May I have it?" Sebastian nodded, throwing a side glance at Miss Rottenmeier to see what effect this request would have upon her. Heidi immediately seized the roll and put it in her pocket. Sebastian's face became convulsed. He was overcome with inward laughter, but he knew his place too well to laugh aloud. Heidi looked wonderingly at him for a minute or two and then said, "Am I to eat some of that too?" Sebastian again nodded. "Give me some then," she said, looking calmly at her plate. At this, Sebastian's command of his countenance became doubtful, and the dish began to tremble suspiciously in his hands. "You may put the dish on the table and come back presently," said Miss Rottenmeier with a severe expression on her face. Sebastian disappeared immediately. "As for you, Adelaide, I see I shall have to teach you the first rules of behavior," continued the housekeeper with a sigh. "I will begin by explaining to you how you are to conduct yourself at table," and she went on to give Heidi minute instructions as to all she was to do. "And now," she continued, "I must make you particularly understand that you are not to speak to Sebastian at table or at any other time unless you have an order to give him or a necessary question to put to him. Then you are not to address him as if he were a relative. Never let me hear you speak to him in that way again. It is the same with Tinette, and for myself you are to address me as you hear others doing. Clara must decide herself what you are to call her." "Why, Clara, of course," said that little girl at once. The housekeeper went on with a long list of rules as to general behavior, getting up and going to bed, going in and out of the room, shutting the doors, keeping everything neat. As she talked, Heidi's eyes gradually closed, for she had been up before 5 o'clock that morning and had had a long journey. She leaned back in her chair and fell fast asleep. When Miss Rottenmeier had at last come to the end of her sermonizing, she said, "Now remember what I have said, Adelaide. Have you understood it all?" "Heidi has been asleep for ever so long," said Clara, her face rippling all over with amusement. She had not had such an entertaining dinner for a long time. "It is really unendurable what one has to go through with this child," exclaimed Miss Rottenmeier in great indignation, and she rang the bell so violently that Tinette and Sebastian both came running in, nearly tumbling over one another. But no noise was sufficient to wake Heidi, and it was with difficulty they could rouse her sufficiently to get her to her bedroom. We'll stop there for today and start tomorrow with Chapter 7. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.